Okay, here we go again, once more, under Military History and Heritage Victoria's conference program. Been doing it for quite a while. I've said before many times now, it's my privilege and pleasure as patron to welcome you to Menace at Home, Australia Under Attack, 1939 through to 1945. As I've said at previous conferences, and once again for the record, Military History and Heritage Victoria was officially launched back in May 2011 by Professor Geoffrey Blaney, who was a very good friend of mine, and I still see him wandering through the Fitzroy Gardens, so we have a chat which is quite pleasant. Geoffrey challenged us to be relevant, and that's a little phrase that stuck with me all the way through as patron and observing what we're doing. And I think we've probably managed that very well. Also for the record, this is the 19th such activity over the last 14 years, which in itself is probably a good thing. But back to this conference. The title, Menace at Home, we believe this conference covers another important and more often than most overlooked area of our military history. And that's probably one of the reasons why the committee decided to tackle it. As you'll know from the program, the sessions cover trouble in the water, a menace off the east coast, then friends or foes, including the war in Australia, especially prisoner of war camps which will emerge, and finish with terror in the sky. I believe the committee has covered a balanced but diversified program for you with an excellent cast of presenters. And if I may, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the convener of this conference, Jason McGregor. Not only our secretary, but brave enough to be a presenter at the conference as well. And I also want to acknowledge the committee that surrounds him. Further, the acknowledgement of our military history sponsors, and in particular Echo Books, and the boss over there is still trying to sort them out as normal. But please humour him during the day because he is a very essential part of our organisation. I should also acknowledge the RSL of Victoria, which look after some of our work, and in doing that I'd obviously like to include this venue and obviously their staff as we go through the day. To you, the attendees, I guess thank you for attending, and I trust that you do enjoy the day. And once again, I certainly am looking forward to it. So, with that opening remarks and welcome, may I introduce our President. Where is the good Colonel? Oh, there he is. Mike Buckridge, RFD, really retired, and as the first session chair, and for Mike to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor David Horner. Michael.
Thank you, Jim, and may I add my welcome to all of you here, and hope that you will get both enjoyment and enlightenment out of the day. I'm sure you will. In a group such as this, excuse me, In a group such as this, our keynote speaker, Professor David Horner, will be well known to you, and perhaps that well-worn phrase, needs no introduction, is justifiable. But introduce him I will, if only to remind you what a significant contribution David has made to the study of military history in Australia. David started his career in the Army, saw active service in Vietnam, and rose to the rank of Colonel as head of the Land Warfare Studies Centre. So his academic achievements are backed by first-hand experience of war. He has written or edited, at the last count, 37 books on military history, defence and intelligence, and is now Emeritus Professor in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. David has spoken to our conferences on a number of previous occasions, and we're very conscious of the privilege we enjoy whenever he agrees to come back for another go. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor David Horner.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and of course it is a great joy to be back here in Melbourne and with the Military History Heritage Victoria. And the topic, of course, is Menace at Home, Australia Under Attack, 1939-1945. In 1942, for the first time since the arrival of Europeans, Australia faced the prospect of foreign invasion. The invasion did not happen, but the war touched the shores of Australia with an intensity not seen before or since. At the same time, Australian forces were in action around the world, in the skies over Europe, in North Africa, Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, and New Guinea. These battles have tended to overshadow in the public memory what was going on inside Australia. But the battles and potential battles at home involved as many Australian servicemen and women as those overseas. This morning I want to do three things. First, I want to provide the strategic and defence policy background as to why the battles took place in and around Australia. Second, I want to detail how Australia came under attack. And third, I want to outline how Australia responded to the threat of attack. And to understand the strategic and defence policy background, we need to go right back to Federation in 1901. At that time, soldiers from the Australian colonies had already served overseas in support of the Empire in New Zealand, Sudan, South Africa and China. However, the leaders of the new Commonwealth government were wary of sending forces overseas in support of the Empire. Therefore, the 1903 Defence Act declared that Australia would have only minuscule permanent forces. Australia's part-time militia was not permitted to serve overseas. Some historians have described two camps within the senior ranks of the permanent forces, the Australianists and the Imperialists. The Australianists believed that Australia was best defended by having a large part-time force that would be kept for service in Australia. The Imperialists believed that Australia was best defended by contributing to the Empire's defence, even if that meant forces might need to be sent overseas. These two philosophical approaches to Australian defence have continued right through to the present time, although the names have changed. Forward defence and support for the United States or the Western Alliance are more recent manifestations of the imperialist school. Defence of Australia, or continental defence, is a successor to the Australianist school. And these schools are not absolute. Both schools have existed side by side, with one side being more prominent at any particular time. Because of the restrictions of the Defence Act, Australia needed to raise a separate volunteer force, the AIF, for service overseas in the First World War. Now, the chance of Australia being attacked in the First World War was very remote, but Australia still maintained its part-time citizen forces to help defend Australia. After the First World War, the imperialists wanted to build up the Navy so it could support Britain's Royal Navy and help secure Australia. And the main feature was, of course, the Singapore strategy, by which Britain would send its main fleet to Singapore in time of threat. All the Australian Army had to do was to provide sufficient forces to deal with enemy raids. However, reflecting the Australianist view, many in the Army believed that the Singapore strategy was flawed. They had identified Japan as a threat, and they believed that Australia needed to have sufficient forces at home to deal with a possible invasion. After the outbreak of the Second World War, the Australian government made 3 decisions that seemed to support an imperialist point of view. First, the government agreed to place its major ships under the control of the British Admiralty, and the ships were deployed away from Australia. Second, the government decided to raise a volunteer force, the second AIF, for service overseas. By the beginning of 1941, 3 AIF infantry divisions were in the Middle East. And the third decision was the government signed up to the Empire Air Training Scheme, by which airmen were trained to serve with the British Royal Air Force in Europe. And this meant that it was hard to build up the RAAF for home defence in Australia. But the Australianist view was not completely abandoned. Before the end of 1939, the government introduced conscription for the part-time citizen force, with its establishment of 5 infantry divisions and 2 cavalry divisions. In mid-1940, the government decided to raise and equip a militia force of 250,000 men for home defence. The limitation was lack of facilities and equipment. Similarly, some naval units were still deployed around Australia. And since Australia could not purchase destroyers or cruisers from Britain, and its larger units were in service overseas, Australia decided to build local defence vessels called corvettes. The first of these was laid down in February 1940, and 17 had been completed by the time of the Pacific War. The Royal Australian Air Force was being built up at home, although the problem was purchasing sufficient aircraft. The government and its military advisors wanted to build up the forces for home defence against the distant prospect of a possible Japanese invasion. But in the first 15 months of the war, the greatest danger at home seemed to come from the activities of the Communist Party that was seeking to undermine the Australian war effort. To deal with this threat, and after much bureaucratic wrangling, in February 1941, the War Cabinet approved the establishment of the Security Service. The Communist threat declined after June 1941, when Hitler's Germany invaded Russia. The Security Service was remodelled as the war progressed, but there was never really a major internal threat. Australians with German or Italian heritage were interned as a precaution. Gradually, the view about the appropriate military strategy began to change. In August 1940, the German auxiliary raider, the Orion, operated in the Tasman Sea and sank several ships. In December 1940, along with the Comet, another German ship, it attacked the Australian protectorate of Nauru, which caused the introduction of trans-Tasman convoys. Mines from the German raider, the Penguin, sank 2 ships and damaged another off the Australian coast in the second half of 1940. Well, after that, there were no more raiders in Australian waters until November 1941, when the German raider, Cormoran, sunk the Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney off the coast of Western Australia. The biggest change came as the Japanese threat developed in late 1940. If Singapore fell to the Japanese, the Singapore strategy would be a failure. In December 1940, the Prime Minister, Menzies, decided to go to London to seek reinforcements for Malaya, and the government decided to send an infantry brigade from the 8th AIF Division to Malaya to help defend Singapore. In February 1941, the Cabinet endorsed a major change in Australia's strategic focus. Australia accepted responsibility to defend Timor, Ambon, New Guinea and Nauru, and the 8th Division was retained for use in the Australian area and in the Far East, rather than deploying it to the Middle East. And over the next few months, small numbers of troops, all that was available, were deployed across the near region. In response to German raiders shelling Nauru, the Army sent 2 18-pounder guns with crews to each of Nauru and Ocean Islands. A battalion from the 8th Division, along with supporting artillery, arrived in Rabaul, and a militia battalion from Brisbane arrived in Port Moresby. Under the Defence Act, the militia could not be sent outside Australia, but of course, Papua was Australian territory. In July 1941, independent companies went to New Ireland and New Caledonia. A brigade of the 8th Division went to Malaya, bringing the division there to strengthen 2 brigades. The division's remaining brigade went to Darwin, from which its battalions could be sent forward to Ambon and Timor as soon as the Netherlands authorities agreed. In mid-December 1941, soon after the outbreak of the war with Japan, 2 AIF battalions were deployed from Darwin to Ambon and Timor, respectively, while an independent company went to Portuguese Timor. The following month, 2 militia battalions went to Port Moresby, bringing the force there to a brigade strength, which was the limit of the force that Australia could maintain. So the long-standing view about Australian defence policy had been completely overthrown. It was no longer sufficient to defend the Australian continent by deploying army units within Australia. The approaches needed to be secured. But by sending forces to the Middle East and Europe in support of imperial defence, Australia had reduced its capacity to deploy forces to the region in defence of Australia. In retrospect, Australia could have fully mobilised its militia in early 1941, rather than waiting until the outbreak of the war with Japan. Even then, however, Australia had insufficient naval and air forces to support units deployed to the region. During 1941, the Australian government also took several major steps to defend Australia at home. In June 1941, a combined operational intelligence centre, a central war room and a combined defence headquarters all were established in Melbourne. Area combined headquarters were established in Townsville, Melbourne, Fremantle and Darwin. In August 1941, Lieutenant General Sir Ivan Mackay was appointed GOC-in-Chief of the Home Forces. Meanwhile, in May 1941, the government took over the Volunteer Defence Corps. It had been established by the RSL in July 1940 for men aged between 18 and 60, including those in reserved occupations. So after the outbreak of the Pacific War, the part-time militia was called up for full-time service, bringing the number to almost 250,000. And even 5,000 members of the Volunteer Defence Corps were called up for full-time duty on aerodrome defence and coast watching. Now you'll be familiar with the rapid advance of the Japanese between December 1941 and February 1942. The Japanese landed in New Britain and defeated the Australian garrisons there, seized Singapore and soon took over the Netherlands East Indies, including capturing Australian battalions on Ambon and Timor. Now perhaps the first battle in the direct defence of mainland Australia came in January 1942, when Allied transport ships sailing towards Darwin were attacked by 2 Japanese submarines. 3 Australian corvettes were deployed from Darwin. One of the corvettes dropped depth charges on the Japanese submarine and sank it. The Darwin area was the focus of the most intense attacks on the Australian mainland. On the 19th of February 1942, the Japanese mounted a major air attack on Darwin, and our area combined headquarters at Darwin disregarded early warnings of the impending attack. Air raid alerts were not sounded until just before the first wave of aircraft appeared over Darwin. American fighters on patrol were taken by surprise, with most shot down. In and around the harbour, ships, wharves and parts of the town suffered great damage. 3 Allied naval ships and 5 merchant ships were sunk, and another 10 ships were damaged. Most of the 260 or so people killed that day were victims of this first wave. The first attack ended 42 minutes after it began. And just over an hour later, the second wave arrived, targeting the military airfield. 6 RAAF servicemen were killed and 9 aircraft on the ground were destroyed. Some troops and civilians, though, showed great courage. The first 2 military medals for bravery in battle on Australian soil were awarded to anti-aircraft gunners for their actions during this battle. Other servicemen and some civilians rescued crewmen from burning ships, many of whom were badly injured. But there were also elements of panic. Some civilians and servicemen went bush or fled south, fearing the raids marked the start of an invasion. This panic and the true extent of the losses was hidden from the Australian public by strict censorship. And Japanese attacks on the Northern Territory continued during 1942. Other areas of Northern Australia suffered attacks. On the 3rd of March 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Brooms Harbour, township and airfield. Dozens of people were killed or wounded and 24 aircraft were destroyed. A small number of raids also occurred on the northeast coast of Australia. In July 1942, Japanese flying boats conducted 3 minor raids on Townsville, which caused little or no damage. By March 1942, there was a very real fear that the Japanese would invade Australia. Barbed wire defences were strung out along the beaches to hinder any Japanese landings. Air raid trenches were dug and blackout precautions minimised the glow of lighting from streetlights and buildings. Gun emplacements were set up around key harbours. Anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were positioned while garrison troops guarded important installations. And during this period of concern, General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia to assume command of the South West Pacific area, and General Sir Thomas Blamey came back from the Middle East to be appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army. And the Australian Army was now organised and deployed to defend Australia. With Army headquarters in Melbourne, the Army had 5 subordinate headquarters. The 1st Army, based in Sydney, the 2nd Army in Melbourne, the 3rd Corps in Perth, Northern Territory Force in Darwin, and New Guinea Force in Port Moresby. Each was responsible for defending their respective areas. The Army in Australia included the equivalent of 8 infantry divisions, 2 motorised divisions and an armoured division. The North Australia Observer Unit, nicknamed the Knackaroos or Kirby's Cowboys, was formed to provide early warning of Japanese activity in Northern Australia. And this was the time of the so-called Brisbane Line. Well, the line certainly existed, and many soldiers remembered digging trenches, but it was not government policy to withdraw behind the line. Rather, defensive positions were dug around all the cities by militia soldiers who were, of course, enlisted in those cities. So there was also a Townsville line, and there was a Newcastle line. Now, while these divisions were supposed to deal with a possible Japanese land invasion, anti-aircraft and coast defence organisations dealt with possible air raids and raids by enemy ships. And these organisations were massive. By the end of 1942, Australia had 2 heavy anti-aircraft regiments, 32 static heavy anti-aircraft batteries, 11 light anti-aircraft regiments, and 16 independent light anti-aircraft batteries. The anti-aircraft artillery force numbered 32,000 men, the equivalent of 2 infantry divisions. And these figures do not include the anti-aircraft units deployed overseas. Later, women soldiers were used to staff searchlight units and to work on radars, predictors and rangefinders. By December 1943, 3,600 women were employed in anti-aircraft searchlight and coast defence units. Most of the anti-aircraft units saw no action. In the Northern Territory, the main defence was provided by RAF fighters. But to give some indication, in 1943, the heavy anti-aircraft batteries in North Queensland, which included Thursday Island, and the Northern Territory, fired almost 10,000 rounds, while the light anti-aircraft batteries fired almost 10,000 rounds. During 1943, they reported that they destroyed 29 enemy aircraft, probably destroyed another 72, and damaged 32. The Coast Defence Organisation consisted of some 57 batteries around the Australian coast. The 15 batteries in the Sydney Port Kembla area were manned by 6,000 personnel. Newcastle had 4 batteries with 6 6-inch Mark 7 guns and 2 9.2-inch Mark 10 guns, manned by more than 1,800 men. In addition to the fixed defences, the Army raised 12 mobile batteries to be deployed around the coast. There were also 16 special radar detachments. And the coast guns saw little action, although the Newcastle battery fired 4 rounds at a Japanese submarine in June 1942, but did so a full 13 minutes after the submarine had fired first. Now, the main threat to shipping in Australian waters came in 1942, when the Japanese launched a submarine campaign off Australia's east coast. On the night of the 31st of May, 1st of June, 3 Japanese midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour, avoided the partially constructed Sydney Harbour anti-submarine boom net, and attempted to sink Allied warships. 2 midget submarines were detected and attacked before they could engage any Allied vessels. The 3rd submarine attempted to torpedo the heavy cruiser USS Chicago, but instead sank the converted ferry HMAS Cuttable, killing 21 sailors. Now, the Japanese raid raised serious questions about the effectiveness of Australian port defences at that time. Immediately following the raid, the 5 Japanese fleet submarines that carried the midget submarines embarked on a campaign to disrupt merchant shipping in eastern Australian waters. In the 2 months after the attack on Sydney Harbour, 14 Allied merchant ships were attacked and 6 of those were sunk. Some 60 merchant seamen died in these attacks, with 29,000 tonnes of shipping lost. And this forced Australian ships to sail along the east coast in convoys and reduce the efficiency of Australian coastal shipping. In the early hours of the 8th of June 1942, 2 submarines bombarded the ports of Sydney and Newcastle. 1 submarine fired 34 shells at Newcastle but caused little damage. The attack lasted about 20 minutes until just after the Fortress fired in reply. Now, as far as defence planners were concerned, the period of the greatest threat came between January and June 1942. While we know that the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May was fought to prevent a Japanese landing at Port Moresby, to the government, to the military chiefs and the public, it seemed as though a Japanese invasion fleet had been prevented from reaching Australia. After 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk in the Battle of Midway in early June, General MacArthur advised the Australian government that the threat of invasion had largely disappeared. But the government made no public announcement, and the public and the troops still prepared to deal with a possible invasion. But the strategy was changing. Whereas previously the armed forces had focused on the defence of Australia, in July 1942, General MacArthur now ordered an offensive aiming to capture Rabaul. Meanwhile, US Navy forces landed at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. But the Japanese beat MacArthur to the punch. They landed in Papua on the night of the 21st, 22nd of July, setting off the Kokoda campaign. To many people, it seemed that Japan was aiming to invade Australia. We now know that was not the case. And after that, General MacArthur remained focused on the New Guinea campaign with the aim of regaining the Philippines. An Australian naval squadron and an RAAF operational group accompanied his advance. From August 1942, RAAF Command under Air Vice Marshal Bostock was responsible for the air defence of Australia. By April 1943, the RAAF commander of the northwest area, based in Darwin but under Bostock, had 5 Australian squadrons and 1 squadron each from Britain, the United States and the Netherlands. 3 squadrons were equipped with Spitfires. On the 2nd of May 1943, 20 Japanese bombers and 0 fighters attacked Darwin, inflicting little damage on the ground. The RAAF fighters, which intercepted the Japanese aircraft, suffered heavy losses. However, several weeks later, on the 20th of June 1943, the Spitfires intercepted a formation of 21 bombers and 21 Japanese fighters and shot down 9 bombers and 5 fighters. 2 Spitfires were shot down. And this was the most successful encounter by the RAAF over Darwin, during which the famous Group Captain Caldwell, an ace from the European theatre, shot down his 5th Japanese aircraft. And one book about the Spitfires in Darwin was subtitled The Real Battle for Australia. The last air raid on Australia was on the 12th of November 1943, when Darwin was attacked for the 64th and final time. In March 1943, the Australian Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Royal, was appointed Commander Southwest Pacific Sea Frontiers, responsible for the close naval defence of Australia, including the conduct and protection of coast convoys around Australia. And Royal had plenty of work to do, as Japanese submarines returned to Australian waters in January 1943, amounted a 6-month campaign along the east coast of Australia. The Japanese deployed up to 12 submarines, and the most successful, the one, sank 6 ships off the coast of New South Wales. One of the heaviest attacks by Japanese submarines came on the 15th of June 1943, when 5 Australian corvettes were escorting 10 merchant ships and 3 landing ships. They were 150 kilometres off Smoky Cape when 2 of the ships were torpedoed. 2 corvettes carried out depth charge attacks, and the rest of the convoy escaped unharmed. The last attack by a Japanese submarine off the east coast of Australia was made by the I-174 on the 16th of June 1943, when she sank the 5,500-tonne merchant ship, the Portmar, and damaged a US landing ship as they were travelling in convoy off the New South Wales north coast. The single greatest loss of life resulting from a submarine attack in Australian waters occurred in the early hours of the 14th of May 1943, when the I-177 torpedoed and sank the Australian hospital ship Centaur off Point Lookout, Queensland, with a loss of 268 lives. Hospital ships such as the Centaur were legally protected against attack under the terms of the Geneva Conventions. The ship had been appropriately lit and marked to indicate that it was a hospital ship and its sinking was regarded as a war crime. The Japanese submarine offensive against Australia was broken off in July 1943 when submarines were redeployed to counter Allied offensives elsewhere in the Pacific. The Japanese had attacked 21 ships and had sunk 14 of them. The Australian naval authorities were concerned about a resumption of the attacks and maintained the coastal convoy system and air patrols until late 1943 when it was clear that the threat had passed. And by that time, in June 1943, the government had finally told the public that the threat of invasion had passed. Therefore, the forces devoted to the defence of Australia were gradually disbanded. Whereas in 1942, Australia had been defended by 11 divisions, by 1945, this had been reduced to barely one. Most of the anti-aircraft groups around Australia had been disbanded. Similarly, the coast defence batteries were either disbanded or put in care and maintenance. So while there are relatively few battles over and around Australia, it was a frightening time for many Australians. The defence of Australia involved a huge effort, including the building of ships, the construction of aircraft and other munitions, and the mobilising of almost 500,000 defenders. But set against the famous battles fought overseas, the war in and around Australia has received much less attention. However, for the men and women involved, it was an experience that shaped the rest of their lives. Thank you very much. Yes?
The floor is open. Bill.
Colonel, at what point did SIGINT materialise as an influencer on the reaction in Australia?
Yeah, the biggest issue with signals intelligence was the question of whether Australia was going to be invaded. It was probably about the middle of 1942 that signals intelligence was starting to indicate that Australia was not going to be invaded. And the signals intelligence that showed that was the interception of the Japanese diplomatic codes. And by that stage, signal intelligence was a worldwide, for the Allies, was a worldwide activity. So that information, which was probably the result of work in Washington and Britain, did come to Australia. So probably about middle of 1942, signal intelligence was indicating that. But the government maintained its posture of defending Australia for another year after that. Signals intelligence was always erratic in the sense that sometimes you could get it and sometimes you couldn't. Signals intelligence was important for the Battle of the Coral Sea, important for Midway. But in terms of what was going on in Australia, most of what happened in Australia was as a result of pondering the question, if the Japanese are going to invade or if they're going to attack Australia, what do we do to protect it? And that didn't rely on signals intelligence. That was an assessment made.
As a result, pardon me for extending this a little bit, as a result, how would you rate 0 to 10 the reaction of the authorities in Australia prior to the SIGINT becoming...
Okay, all right. Now, I think it's absolutely reasonable for the government and the military authorities to be concerned about a possible invasion of Australia in February and March 1942. Now, whether we want to rate the level of panic of the government is another matter. Some ministers were very, very panicky, others were not. But in general terms, the government was, and the military advisors were quite right to make that assessment in February, March 1942 that Australia might be invaded. But from the time of the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is early May, it was now unlikely that Australia would be invaded. And as I was talking about with signals intelligence, by about June, we knew that it was not. Now, it's a political judgment being, and perhaps a military judgment being made for the next year that we still have to take precautions. But some authors, some historians have criticised the government for holding on a bit too long. The argument put by some authors is that for political reasons the government wanted to maintain the threat of invasion because that enabled them to keep the economy on an absolute war footing.
You mentioned the amount of anti-aircraft locations during that sort of critical period, especially around Port Kembla, and very intensive installations given the importance of the steelworks. The company I work for is an environmental approvals company. We have lots of archaeologists doing general work, but at the moment we're undertaking an historical dig of a tank trap in Port Kembla.
How interesting.
Yeah. So does that mean that, was that a standard thing around ports, or was there a real concern that there'd be a seaborne invasion of Port Kembla, hence why the tank trap was there?
I think the tank trap is probably a bit of an overreaction, but there is the danger of shelling Port Kembla.
Yep.
And if you can knock out Australia's steel industry, well, you'd be. In a similar vein, but on a slightly smaller scale, we were building the corvettes initially at Whyalla, and Whyalla's right up the Gulf. So we deployed anti-aircraft units to Whyalla. These 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns were just like the German 88s. Were very good in the horizontal role as well. So the anti-aircraft guns that were around the port of Whyalla would do 2 lots of training. One would do possible air attack. The other one is firing at an enemy ship that might be wanting to shell Whyalla. And so they would, a boat would go out there and drag a barge or something, and they would shoot at it. So that is the concern in places like Whyalla, Port Kembla, Newcastle, and Whyalla.
Thank you, sir. I have a question regarding the Brisbane line.
Yeah.
Before contentious. Would you, from what you're saying, describe that more as Brisbane, not Brisbane, invasion zones, perhaps, or defence zones?
No, not so much invasion zones. As I had a couple of quick throwaway lines on what I was saying, because I didn't want to go into great depth. But remember, the militia come from a town, a city. They go home and then they come back again. So when they raised the militia divisions, they were initially in the place where they were raised. So if you raise a militia division, for example, based in Newcastle, well, what they do is they start digging defence trenches. Oh, they said, we're digging the Newcastle line. And so you do meet people who say, well, of course there was a Brisbane line because I helped dig it. Yes, this was. That's different from the philosophy that we would somehow withdraw behind the Brisbane line and leave it north of Australia. And that was an idea floated for political reasons, military political reasons and political reasons. But there is no evidence that the government ever approved that idea of withdrawing behind the Brisbane line.
Andrew, David, you mentioned the attacks on Darwin, air attacks. What about on the west coast of Western Australia and Queensland?
I did mention those. I mentioned the one on Broome. And I also mentioned the little one up there at Townsville, which I think a child was slightly wounded, but that was the limit of the damage up there in Townsville. Yeah. So I did mention those, and they're also attached on Thursday Island too.
Thank you, Professor Horner. This is my first ever question I've asked in this type of context, so please excuse me. Has anyone done work on what was actually the Japanese strategy in attacking Sydney Harbour? Because the submarines, I understand, came from Truk and also attacked Madagascar, synchronised.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
So what's the biggest strategy here?
Well, the best thing they can do is to sink major Australian ships. And of course, the one in Sydney was to try and
Chicago.
Chicago. I mean, you know, it's Chicago heavy cruiser. You know, it was a heavy
battle
cruiser.
cruiser.
So and similarly for Madagascar. Yeah. I think also, you know, it's a war. Keep the enemy on the defensive. Keep the enemy off guard. That's what, you know, Japanese thinking. Yeah.
It's extraordinary, the two extremes.
Yes, it is extraordinary. Yeah, and I think the one in Madagascar was more successful, if I remember.
Yes, David, could you comment on the degree to which Australian industry and the Australian civilian workforce was mobilised?
Oh yes, yes. The government introduced something called the manpower, which really was directing where people could work, and which meant that people were forced to work in munitions industries. And it really is an amazing, considering the population of Australia, considering that we're about 7 million, and at any particular time we had about 700,000 people in uniform. Total war effort was 1 million in uniform, about 700,000. And so they're taken away from the work, from the workers, and it's really an amazing effort. It's sort of the industrialisation of Australia that went on in the Second World War, not just to produce corvettes, but to produce other weapons, aircraft, even the tank which didn't see action. That's an amazing effort in terms of the industrialisation of Australia. Really set up Australia for the post-war period in terms of industry.
One more question, then we...
David, can we bring it to a local situation down south? Do you have any insight into the Melbourne defence posture at the time? What did we look like doing this?
Oh yes, and of course you had the gun emplacements at Queenscliff, and on the other side there, yes, and they were fully manned. In fact, they went into action at the beginning of the war. In terms of an organisational structure, after Blamey came and the army got reorganised, I talked about the armies, Second Army First. They also had lines of communication area. So there'd be the New South Wales lines of communication area and the Victoria lines of communication area, which was mainly to do with providing logistic support. But under them came things which were called like the Melbourne Fortress. And Melbourne Fortress would have an artillery officer, probably about the rank of full colonel, who would command it. So he would command the anti-aircraft and he would command the coast defences. And that was replicated around Australia. So Victoria had the Melbourne Fortress. The fortress being not one place, but all the different places which would come under the fortress commander. And just incidentally, while we're talking about fortress commanders, the guy who commanded New South, the Sydney area fortress, Brigadier John Whitelaw was the guy who was promoted to Major General to become the Major General Artillery. So in the Second World War, we had a Major General Artillery, we had a Major General Signals, and we had a Major General Engineers. The only time in Australian military history in which we've had Major Generals commanding artillery, signals and engineers, but particularly the artillery guy commanded this massive artillery force, and he did that through these fortress commanders.
David, thank you very much for a very entertaining and informative. Ladies and gentlemen, it's